If we're going to be talking about postmodernism, postmodern fiction, postmodern literature, I think a useful way to start is to try to come up with some kind of working definition of postmodernism. You know, for I think for a lot of us, there's this "I know it when I see it" quality, which is fine, and that's going to certainly be present in a lot of what I discuss on this channel, but I think we can do better than that. I think we can at least come up with some shared definition of what we're talking about that will help guide and crystallize the conversation. And so that's what I want to start to do here. And defining postmodernism is hard. It's been hard for lots of people. There's a lot of reasons why it's hard. It's a very complex topic, and it covers a lot of time, and it covers a lot of individuals and trends, and there's a great deal of variety and contrarianness in there. Part of what postmodernism is bucking the trend, which makes it harder to define something. And there are some, I think, straightforward definitions that sometimes people use that I don't find to be terribly useful. And these are the definitions that are really kind of time-based. So you'd say, okay, postmodernism started in 1950. Or postmodernism started with the atom bomb. Or the first postmodernist author was Vladimir Nabokov, right? And I think there's legitimate arguments to be made for all three of those and other things like them. But that doesn't really help us, right? Because not everybody is moving at the same rate in a certain era. And even today, most of the people who are writing and publishing are traditionalists. They're not postmodernists. So we can't just look at a time period. Time period can be useful in terms of saying what were the trends and how did things change over time. But just slapping it down and saying, okay, after 1950, we're all postmodernists, is not terribly useful. And we can do considerably better than that. And I do have a working definition I've had for a long time that has a lot of things going for it. It's very easy to articulate. It's a simple concept that we can wrap our head around and we can remember and we can describe very simply and clearly. It is something I feel is extremely defensible. Like, I can have a debate with anyone in the world and defend this viewpoint as the definition of my definition of postmodernism. And ultimately, it is seminal. It is useful, right? It starts us down paths that lead to useful and interesting exploration and intellectual work. And I will caution the one thing about this definition, because it is so general, that just on its own, in the absence of that exploration, I think the amount of benefit you get from it is relatively small. So you got to think of it as a starting point. It's a trailhead, and we have to hike the trail to get the benefit. But at least now we have a starting point, right? We have a place to head off from, and we have at least some semblance of a map. And so that gets us going on the exploration that ultimately gets us to really useful insights and thoughts about postmodernism and what is it. So, Tim's pithy definition of postmodernism. Postmodernism is the response to modernism. So it's built right into the name. It's postmodernism. What this is the modernist movement, which was so incredibly powerful and influential and earth-shattering, seismic in what it did to art, to all forms of art, could not help but redefine the way that any kind of educated, self-aware, earnest artist thought about their medium and their craft. And so if that's what modernism did to us, then how does it change us? And what do we come out of the other side of modernism as? And that is postmodernism. Now again, you could say, well, Tim, that doesn't tell me anything, right? I can't make a list off that. I can't go check something and make objective criteria and say, this is or is not postmodernist. I'd say, yes, you're absolutely right. But it's the trailhead, right? It's how we start this conversation that ultimately does lead to things like those checklists. And I intend in this channel, over time, far too complicated to do it in one single episode, but I intend over time to take that hike with you, to do that journey and that exploration, and we'll pull out our machetes and we'll cut our way through the jungle, and we will come to some conclusions, or I'll come to some conclusions, right? And if you don't agree with me, you can find a way to feedback to me, email or comment or whatever, and we'll talk about it. But that is the plan. And the where to start on postmodernism is that, right? It's the response to modernism. Now, crocodiles all the way down, right? So now we're going to go to the next thing. We're going to say, well, what's modernism, right? And I could keep going back. What's Victorian literature? What's et cetera, but let's try to cap it at modernism for now. For the simple reason, again, that everything's intertwined and it's a big giant web. It's a skein of things. And if you keep pulling on threads, you never stop. And, I just have to sit here and talk to the podcast for the rest of my life, right? And so we're going to have to put some boundaries. And we'll put our boundary on a crisp, simple definition of modernism for now. And I'm sure we'll be returning to modernism too, because to talk about postmodernism, you have to talk about modernism. It's built in. And modernism, at its most basic level, is a rejection of the proscriptive rules that society and a certain set of societal influencers had placed on art, right? Coming into modernism, there was an assumption that art had to be done a certain way. And you must do these things, and you must follow these techniques, right? And if Plato said it, it must be right. And if Plato didn't say it, then it can't be right, right? And this was kind of built into everybody's assumptions, right? And if your paintings didn't look like the Dutch masters, your paintings couldn't be good. You had to imitate the Dutch masters. You had to imitate Plato and Shakespeare. And if you didn't do that, it couldn't, by definition, be good. And in a lot of ways, that's the assumption that kind of existed, through the 1800s, through the, like I said, the Victorian era, and, even in places other than England, United States, you had similar things. You had this, and, countries where they were writing in non-English languages, you had these similar things, right? You had this real assumption that you kind of had to do what people had always done. You had to do what the past masters did, right? So if I were a writer in that era, it was very predictable in a lot of ways what we were going to do. We were going to tell unique stories, but we're going to tell them in a certain specific way. It was, send the monkey up the tree, throw rocks at the monkey, bring the monkey down from the tree, right? And you had to do that. You had to have rising action, falling action, denouement, all that stuff we learned in our creative writing classes in college. You had to do that, and if you didn't do that, by definition, it was bad. And so you got a group of people in various media, and it really started with painting, but everything's connected, and people see other things, and so it moved into other kinds of arts. But you had a group of people who said, no, I don't accept it. I can make a good painting that doesn't look like the Dutch masters. And I can have different assumptions about lighting and perspective and color palette and, physical inflection of human models. And starting with that, they began to challenge. And so it started with, relatively mild things like Impressionism and Pointillism. And it moved on to more and more aggressive things like Cubism and pure abstract art and splatter paintings, right? And finally you get Jackson Pollock saying, I don't want to represent at all. I'm going to put paint on a canvas and I'm not going to pretend that it represents anything. And what is that? That is an objection, not an objection, a rejection of these ideas that had been thrust upon artists that you must do it a certain way, and if you don't do it this way, it is by definition bad. And so the modernists were saying no, right? And in literature, it wasn't just painting at all. And in literature, we saw the exact same thing. You saw a bunch of people saying, I'm going to break out of this, chase the monkey up the tree, bring the monkey down the tree, and all these other assumptions, right? Sentences must be structured a certain way, and this percentage of it should be adjectives, and all this kind of, assumptions that were built into this, these real kind of stiff, stodgy assumptions. And so you get, Faulkner writing 30-page parenthetical notes, and the spare muscular prose of Hemingway, and the extreme reductionism of Beckett, and people playing with concrete poetry, and Ezra Pound mixing multiple languages into a similar poem. All of this stuff, and the kind of elliptical nature of Wallace Stevens or T.S. Eliot. All of this is a rejection. Or maybe the classicest, most classic example is E. Cummings saying, I'm just going to abandon assumptions of punctuation and capitalization. And these were rejections of those rules, saying, no, we won't follow those rules. And by not following those rules, we believe we're going to build something new and fresh that's different and better than what we could have done if we had simply mindlessly robotically followed the rules that had been given to us by the schoolmasters in the places that we went to school. And so that's, that in a nutshell is a horribly oversimplified version. But, that was kind of the defining gestalt of modernism in a most basic way. And so, it was this sort of deliberate, exuberant smashing of everything that could conceivably be smashed. They wanted to break all the glass. Now it happens they didn't break all the glass because some of the glass they missed or they couldn't. They still weren't able to see that there was glass there, right? And so glass continues to get broken through the postmodernist phase, but not through any want of trying among the modernists. Not because there were any modernists who said, no, we don't want to break that glass. It's just they didn't realize there was glass to be broken, right? And so that's where you are. So after this goes on for, roughly half a century, and if you're a self-aware artist who's really trying to contribute something valuable and important and not just rehash what's happened before, how do you do that, right? When everything's been obliterated, how do you do that? And that's so much of what postmodernism is about, is moving forward on actually making useful, valuable, expressive art that means something and connects to an audience and is satisfying to one's soul, in the hangover of this party of just trashing everything you can see, right? And how do we do that? What do we do? How do we make forward progress that is meaningful and isn't just random, right? And that is, I think, the defining genius of the postmodern movement and the postmodern aesthetic and the postmodern intellectual exercise, right? That is the problem that postmodernism is solving, is what do we do? And so right there, you start to see, I think, the important difference between postmodernism and modernism, which is postmodernism is aware there is an awareness in postmodernism that is much higher and more finely tuned than the awareness in the modernists. The modernists were like, drunken bulls with billy clubs smashing everything up. I know I stuck 3 metaphors in that sentence, but go with me. 3 similes if you want to be precise, but go with me. Postmodernists are much more awake and aware and introspective in a way that I think modernism was, in a lot of ways, naive and blinded and kind of stumbling through the dark, right? So modernists were just trying to say, why do I need punctuation, right? And a postmodernist would say, well, okay, if I accept that I don't need punctuation, now let me start to ask, how is punctuation a useful tool if I'm getting away from the Chicago Manual of Style, strict rules approach to punctuation, and instead I'm going to say punctuation is a tool that I as an artist get to use as I see fit. What do I want to do with it, right? And just randomly scattering punctuation marks over the page like you dipped a paintbrush in black paint and flicked it at the page doesn't really get us anywhere, right? So I'm going to give some thought to what this means to me and what I'm going to do to this. That's more of a postmodern approach. It's an aware approach. And you get much more of this awareness in postmodernism. And I think that's kind of where I draw the defining line between these two trends, these two major artistic movements in our history, is this awareness, and this takes a lot of different shapes, right? So this awareness comes out in a lot of different ways. It's the interest in form and structure. It's the self-awareness and meta-ness that you get in a lot of postmodernism. This idea that all of the past is available to me as my toolkit, that I can go back and I can pull tropes and techniques and characters and stories from the past and bring them in and use them, that they're my tinker toys that I get to play with, right? This kind of sense of recursiveness. I'm always looking at myself, and I'm looking at myself, looking at myself, and I'm looking at myself, looking at my, and crocodiles all the way down. It's that, right? The plurality of voices that is very popular in postmodernism. The questioning of our own narrative voice and our own ability to perceive and to judge, the unreliable narrator, right? A deliberate embracing, the deliberate embrace of complexity or massive scope or encyclopedic nature, or what people call it, what you might call maximalness, is a very postmodern thing. And of course, the embrace of new media and new technology, absolutely. It's very postmodern. And so, all of these things, they're different. There's unique, distinct, different trends and tropes and tendencies, right? And techniques, to use a bunch of T words, that we will continue to see and return to over and over and over again in this series, in this channel. But they all have the uniting thread that there are these aware responses to the completely trashed house that the modernists left for us, right? And that is what postmodernism is doing. That's how postmodernism is picking up and moving forward in the wake of the wanton destruction of all conventions, norms, and assumptions. That is what modernism ultimately proved to be when taken to its most extreme, when taken to its logical conclusion. And so, again, this is the definition. This is my definition. And I think it is true. I think it is ultimately useful for us, again, as the starting point in a lot of different explorations where we will delve down into these various aspects of postmodernism and form and technique and vocabulary and all of these things that we're going to get into. And I think for most of this podcast, we're probably going to be operating one or several levels of granularity deeper than this. But I believe that I'm going to continue to come back to this definition and the defining qualities of this definition over and over again. So I wanted to start with this and kind of lay that out. And, think about that as an idea, right? Postmodernism is a response to modernism's desire to smash everything. And after everything has been smashed, now again, postmodernists, when they discover something that modernists haven't smashed, they say, oh goody, and they smash it, right? So there is still that going on. But, to the degree that once everything has been smashed, if you look around through the debris and say, okay, well, how am I going to build stuff now? That is really what postmodernism is. And I'm going to keep returning to this. I will say this is a definition of postmodernism. There are other ways you could look at it and talk about it, and it may be useful to us later to do that instead. And I don't think that it's fundamentally wrong to say, okay, I'm going to throw out a different definition now, and here's what it's going to be. Modernism is what happened after Vladimir Nabokov came along. And there are reasons. Postmodernism is how society changed because of the atomic bomb, right? There are reasons why that could also be an interesting, useful, and ultimately defensible, and ultimately true conversation. And that's fine too, and we may do that. I don't think there's anything wrong with taking multiple cracks at something this important to this channel. But of course, I'm a postmodernist, so I wouldn't think there's anything wrong with that now, would I? And let's leave it there for now. Thank you very much. I'm Tim Callan.